Welcome to Season 4 of Transforming 45. I'm your host, Lisa Boat, and this season we're stepping fully into our power. The heat, the hormones, the heartbreak, the healing. This is Midlife, raw and redefined. Each episode, you'll hear stories of humans who are rewriting the rules, reclaiming their bodies, their desires, their voices. This is where we stop shrinking, start shining, and remember who the hell we are. Because midlife isn't a crisis, it's an awakening. Let's get transforming 45. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Transforming 45. This week, I am really excited to welcome Carla Wainwright. She is a holistic wellness coach, sexual awakening facilitator, and midlife alchemist. Carla works with women over 40 to help them reclaim vitality, support their hormone health, and reconnect with pleasure and personal power. What makes Carla's work so powerful is how she blends science and sacredness. With a background in biology, homeopathy, and more than 30 years in the healing arts, she bridges metabolic health, nervous system healing, and sensual embodiment in ways that feel both deeply practical and profoundly transformative. Carla, I am so glad you are here today. Intimacy and desire is something that really has been coming up a lot lately in the community that I'm working with. So I'm so glad we're having this conversation today. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm thrilled to be here.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Who are you and how did life introduce you to this version?
I love this question. And it's interesting that I have asked a question like this to women on retreats where they get asked the question over and over again, who are you? And of course, we start with all of the roles and all of the things that are easy to grasp. And then there are more pauses because you have to actually figure out, well, what's underneath all of those layers? And I had to do the same thing in contemplating that. And so I feel like I'm going to give you a very esoteric answer, but I really sat with it and it felt very true to me. And, I really feel like I'm a human being who at her core tries to welcome in an expanding consciousness of love into everything that I do in life. It doesn't sound, like I'm not leading this life as this ultra spiritual person who doesn't make mistakes and doesn't have conflict and all of those things, but leading my life from a lens of welcoming in an expanding consciousness of love, and where I really truly believe that as human beings, our essence is love, that really becomes the North Star in all the different facets of my life, whether that's relationships, whether that's family, whether that's work, business, all of these various things. I try to always connect myself back to that really deep inner knowing within myself that is who I am at my core. Yeah.
Thank you. I love an esoteric answer. It's probably my favorite. I had another guest who said, when I asked that question, she said, I am light. I was like, right. We try in our humanness, we feel like we have to give all of these very complicated answers to this when really I am light, or I am love, or I am energy. That really is what is underneath everything else that we pile on to try to give ourselves definition in this earth space that we find ourselves in.
Yes. Yeah. Very well said.
Yeah. So thank you. I really appreciate that. And knowing that is your core and that is where you are coming from, what is it that brought you to this work?
Yes. So I guess I need to go back to the beginning. And, I've always been a very sensitive and an intuitive person. And as a child, I really felt very connected to nature, to really being aware of people and their feelings. But that actually created a lot of conflict in my life. So I had a very challenging relationship with my father. I was bullied in school. I was continually told over and over that I was too emotional, whereas nature had always been my place of solace and connection. And really, I've always had this deep fascination with the microcosm and detail and really seeing things, like pausing and seeing things. Because of all those various conflicts I experienced when I was a young person, I actually ended up kind of like throwing myself in the opposite direction. I became very sort of obsessed with academics and science and wanting validation, whereas I wasn't getting that from just being who I was who I was innately. If I look back on it now, I was really rejecting who I was at my core. and just to really try to fit in, which is, of course, a very human instinct. And we all want to fit in. I mean, that is just so important as human beings, that we feel like we have connections and that we can be validated, in our communities. But that, of course, didn't lead me to very much happiness. And then overlaying all of that, I experienced 2 sexual assaults in my 20s that were quite traumatic, and they really dysregulated my nervous system. Intimacy became extremely difficult, and it really became this breaking point for me. I had a master's degree in conservation biology. I was a published author. I was doing all of these things. I was working in a system where I actually just felt like a token person who was signing things off and not actually making any meaningful contribution to the environment or wildlife. And then I was dealing also with this trauma, and which was just affecting me, of course, on a day-to-day level, with so much dysregulation and challenges around that. So I started to search for healing. And of course, I didn't find that in the mainstream system at all. I actually, I ended up seeing a psychiatrist who basically said that he couldn't help himself. And so that, then created more of a spiral, and really, and I'm sure some of your listeners can relate of having, similar stories like this. So I just had to completely reject the mainstream system because I just wasn't getting any support there. So that's where I got my first glimpse into homeopathy and had this incredible healing event that happened. And then I went to a yoga class and had another incredible experience where I was feeling my body in ways that reminded me of what I had lost. And I started to just change the direction of my life. So for many years, I kind of straddled both. I was doing my work as a wildlife biologist, but I opened a yoga studio, and I studied homeopathy, and I did all of these things. And over time, I really began to recognize that my true calling was coming back to this sensitivity, this wisdom of the body, this capacity to connect so deeply with nature, and to really embrace these qualities of the feminine that I didn't know what those were when I was a young person, like a child. But I began to see the power of that. And so that really took me on this path of connecting with the divine feminine, the sacred feminine, nature, the earth priestess arts, all of this. And in my own healing, which was quite profound, I began to work with women also in this capacity of using the sacred feminine as the compass, as this path towards healing. And then, of course, perimenopause happened, and I just started to experience different things happening in my body. Some old patterns resurfaced. I was really struggling with stress. I was really struggling with a lot of symptoms. And I realized that as powerful as the feminine practices were, they were not the whole picture. And I needed more support. And this is when I began to return back to the science. And so not as a rigid system that I was hiding behind, but more of a framework to nourish and understand the body. And so this is really bringing me where I am today, which is recognizing that, as women, we need to, as we age and move through this really powerful transition time, we do need the support of really honoring this physical vessel through like health, and through supporting our hormones, and through lifestyle, and all of the things that we do. And coupling that with the wisdom of the feminine and energetic practices, when we bring these two things together, this is just like such an incredible container to hold us as we move through this really powerful transition in our body. That's the
Yeah.
short of it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that, all of the wholeness of your story. I know when we get to this stage, we all have a winding road with lots of different experiences that make up the core of who we are now. And there's a theme that's been coming up in my conversations over the last month or so, and it really has been this nature and return to the wisdom of the body. It keeps coming up over and over and over again. And when you were talking, and when people talk about this, like when we were children and had this innate connection to nature, I think back to my grandparents had this cottage on an island just outside of North Bay, and there was a rock outcropping, and I can still see on the rock outcropping where the lake would come up and the waves would lap. And there was this triangle cut out in the rock that had sand and small rocks, and sometimes crayfish would get in there and other things. And the water would just wash through as the waves lapped on that rock. And I could have sat there for hours watching this little triangle all of the divinity that I saw happening in that tiny little microcosm. It was when you said the microcosm where I thought immediately I can still call up that image in my mind. And one of the things that I think is really key for us at this stage is going back to that childlike wonder and connection, because I'm sure you get this question a lot as well is, but how, right? How do I reconnect to myself and start doing some of this healing? And it can be as simple as doing that, reconnecting with some of that childlike wonder about the incredible beauty that surrounds us.
I absolutely agree. And as you were saying that, I could really picture the small Lisa doing that. For myself, I loved picking up rocks and looking at what was underneath them. And I could spend hours doing that. And so the how, so much of that is around creating space and slowing down, right? So that childlike wonder, if you just remember yourself at that age, you just sat there for as long as you felt the connection and the impulse to do that. And we lose that as we get older. And of course, with so many things calling upon our attention now, the slowing down piece is so important. And it's also really, really difficult, right? So if you invite yourself into a situation, okay, I'm going to just allow myself to be in nature and I'm going to say, like, for 15 minutes, I mean, because you want to take small pieces of that to just I'm going to just sit here and just look at the grass and notice. That can feel really uncomfortable because we're so not used to it, right? We're so used to having continual stimulation. And so to just allow ourselves to slow down is a very powerful practice, and it's simple and it's not easy.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the other thing that can happen when we slow down, sorry, there's about three avenues I want to take to get into this
Sure.
conversation, this point that I want to make. And that is, I think, so I don't know of a woman yet who hasn't had some sort of sexual trauma in their background, be it actually to themselves, whether it was something we minimized as like, oh, well, it's just because that is something we do, right? We minimize these things. Sometimes we don't even remember it. It's suppressed, whether it's happened to someone that we know, but when we walk the path with that person we know, we can't help but be splashed by the waves of that. And when we start to slow down, and I often refer to perimenopause as this like I used to call it a call, but it's a yank back to the body. And over decades, we've developed strategies of abandoning and being outside of the body because there is so much discomfort often within. So when we are yanked back into the body and we sit and we start being in some of this stillness, and some of that happens because of the changes that are in our lives. We're perhaps not in the same kind of intense parenting that we were doing. Things in our job might be shifting and changing. Caregiving roles might be changing. And so we have a little bit more spaciousness to do this sitting. And when we do, it can be uncomfortable and painful because it's now making space for all that we have been running from for decades to start to come back up to the surface. And so, how do you support the humans that you work with to make space for this in their healing process?
So I think what's really key, and you're exactly right, is that a lot of our past traumas do come up in perimenopause, and part of that is because of our, the shifts that are happening in terms of being able to manage stress. And so the trigger could happen, whereas before, would be able to kind of move through it, and then it doesn't happen that way, and so these things come up. So what I think is really, really essential is this idea of titration, of really just going very slow, dipping in and coming out. Because for so many women, because we've just been so desensitized from our bodies and just living in basically a stress soup, for decades, allowing that space to just feel and be, as we just said, it can be really uncomfortable, and it actually can be more than uncomfortable, right? Because then it's like, then you actually have to be with whatever is coming to the surface or asking to be seen. So titration, this idea of just taking a little bit and then coming back and resourcing. So resourcing perhaps of being with your feet on the grass or being with somebody, that you feel really safe with, or just stroking your arms or anything like that. And just doing these small little titrated pieces and gradually beginning to extend that. And I mean, that is when you're doing that with someone. So when I'm doing that with women, there's that beautiful co-regulation piece that happens. But, for women who are listening who may not be working with a practitioner necessarily, that's always my advice is like, so many of us are A-type overachievers. We want it all. I'm going to heal it like this afternoon at 3 p.m. Doesn't
Yeah.
work that way. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, how can you create a sense of safety in just little tiny pieces, and then coming back to a place of just finding an inner resource or some way to regulate yourself. And then maybe that's it for the day. And then maybe, you have more capacity to go a little bit further with that as time goes on.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful approach. And I think it also, as you were talking, reminded me of sometimes we also just need to let the body do the processing. So when we think about healing and we think about all of, we think about words and language and what do I say and how do I express that? And there is so much power in silence and also just letting the body do some of the processing and healing. And I have recently begun a yin yoga practice, which my earlier self would never have allowed myself to do for exactly this like type A. It was not challenging enough. That was not, going to be a good use of my time. And it has been one way that I have actually been able to start to get back into my body and let my body do the releasing. And last week I found myself, I went 3 days in a row. And on the third day, there was some sort of transformation that happened where I was in a deep pigeon and I just started weeping. All that trauma that I've from lots of many different things that I'd held in my hips and in that space just started coming out. And, you know, as we do, I try to temper it so that the people on either side of me aren't worried about this woman who's weeping in the middle. And then we went on to a posture on our backs, and my ears were filling with
Mm.
tears. And it is exactly like that is what my body needs right now, is just this for right now. Will not be the only thing, but in this moment, that is what's allowing my body to process some of this lifetime that I've lived until this point.
Yes. So, as a longtime yoga teacher, I can tell you with absolute certainty, and I've taught yin yoga for years, it is a much more challenging practice than, vinyasa or something that's much more active because you have to slow down and you're holding something that could be physically challenging or uncomfortable for several minutes, which brings up all of these emotions. And you're so right. There's that saying, the issues in the tissues, right? And we don't always have to go back and revisit certain situations and tease them apart and analyze them. Like the body has so much wisdom, and the body just needs space to be able to do that really, really deep healing work. So, just exactly as you're saying, this is the practice for you right now. And all of this unwinding that's happening is a consequence of you giving yourself the space to just allow it to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And then as we are reconnecting with our bodies and everything that's coming up is coming up for us, it's not happening in isolation, right? We are in relationship with other humans, be it a partner, be it friends, be it our children, whatever it may be. And I think those intimate relationships can be sort of the most impacted, especially when we're talking about like long-term body trauma that's coming to the surface. So we have the emotional and the spiritual component of what's happening as well as the physical. Right. So we know that natural lubrication is declining with the decline of estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. Vaginal tissue is getting thinner and more sensitive. And so it doesn't feel the way it used to. So we have this like perfect storm of physical changes, emotional changes, spiritual changes happening. How do you, with the people that you're working with, how are you seeing that play out in relationships?
Well, it certainly can cause a lot of conflict, right? So, you know, the highest rate of divorce happens for women in their 40s and 50s. And, it's not only around sex and sexuality, but certainly that can be a contributing factor. And because many couples, even ones who've been together for a really long time, don't necessarily have um, really open, authentic communication skills, it can be really difficult to talk about these things. So, it's, of course, we can engage in sex, which is such an intimate act, but actually talking about sex is the most intimate piece of that, right? Really, like, what did you experience? What are your needs? What are my needs? All of those sorts of things. So, a lot of women experience challenges and conflicts in their relationship. And, many times their partner wants to be helpful, but doesn't actually know how. And so a big piece around this is actually there's a couple pieces. So of course, providing guidance on how to communicate in a way where both people can feel like they can be heard. There are many beautiful different practices you can do and containers that you can create with your partner to be able to express and share. Again, with this idea of titration in mind, because I know in my own experience, it took me many, many years because of my trauma to, if my partner would ask me what I wanted, I couldn't even answer the question because I would go into freeze. Right. And I just thought, like, how can I not know what I want? It was such a disconnect for me and it was frustrating for him. And then when I started to realize that actually the reason that I couldn't communicate that was because, I was having this trauma response and my nervous system really needed, gentle and loving support and titration to be able to move into that. That was very, very helpful. So that is the kind of thing that I definitely work on with women, of being able to find your voice in increasingly expansive and safe ways. And then also really understanding what's happening in the body by listening to what the body has to say, right? There's so much wisdom, of course, in everyone's body, but as women in our womb space, in our sexual organs, and actually having the opportunity to hear what those parts of you have to say. And I know that, if you've never done that kind of work, it sounds like weird, like, okay, well, how is that? How are you
Yeah.
doing that? But, there is a process where, you can drop into the body and allow those parts to have a voice through, of course, your own voice. And it's not your brain doing it. It's not your conscious mind doing it. It's actually your body communicating with you. And that can be super powerful. And so kind of merging these different ways of creating a deeper sense of clarity, more connection, and enhancing communication. It's kind of like a three-pronged approach. It's really, really vital to supporting a woman to stay connected to her sexual energy and her sexual pleasure. And, just because we age and things change doesn't mean we still don't want to have a fulfilling sex life. It's not for everyone, but many women want to continue that. And I would say that there are many women who, as they transition into postmenopause, end up having the best sex of their lives, well into their 70s and beyond. Right. I've talked to many women like that. So it is all possible. Absolutely.
Yeah, there are a bunch of thoughts that came to mind. I just want to say that last part. While you were talking, when you said women, can continue and maybe have some of the best sex life they've had at this point. And I thought, yeah, because you know what? Now it's not for a purpose. Up until now, there's always been a motivation or a purpose, whether it was attracting a partner, all of the different ways that we utilize our sexuality throughout our lives, or then it's for creating a family and having children. There's purpose and drive behind all of these things. And now it gets to be purely for pleasure. And that's a really thank you. That's a gift because I really hadn't thought about it like that before this conversation of now it just gets to be whatever I want it to be or my partner and I want it to be. And that's a really powerful shift in perspective. And the other part I wanted to really get into is what you said around letting yourself sit with what do I actually want and what feels good to me? Because in all of that drive and all of that purpose driven, we often have not allowed ourselves to do that. Paired with all of the shame that exists around women's sexuality, it's one of the last things we ever think about, right? It's more often than not, how am I in service? What am I doing for someone else? And so that giving yourself grace because it will feel very unfamiliar likely. And that I think that like again, listening to that wisdom of the body and letting yourself sit with those questions is really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. So many women actually have no idea what they want. It's not that they may not have pleasurable experiences, but they may never have been asked. And yes, we're very good at giving and not necessarily at receiving. It can be really uncomfortable to receive in a way that has you in the sense of being an active participant and asking for what that is, right? So, what I suggest to women is to really start small and to even just, you know, break it down into small pieces. Like what kind of, like if you just do a practice with your hands, like what kind of touch do you like? Do you like it fast? Do you like it slow? Do you like, what kind of pressure should it be? What is the quality of touch? Then you can move to different senses like hearing, like what are the kinds of sounds that you enjoy? Music, maybe it's breathing, maybe it's like whispering, sweet nothings of, loving affirmations, smells, all of these various things. And you could have your partner kind of create, various experiences for you to try out so that you actually can be like, oh, I like that. No, I don't like that, right? Because you may actually have no idea. We have a lot of preconceived notions. And especially because of, media and culture, we also have a lot of notions that of things we think we're supposed to like, which may actually not be true for you at all.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really important to do some of that unwinding and that the communication with your partner. So going back to what you said about like the act of sex is intimate, but talking about it is even more so. And we are not taught how to have those conversations. So not only do we not know how to have the conversation, we often don't even have the language for how to do so. I've been really intrigued lately about men's experience of perimenopause and menopause. And so I've been gathering through a survey, I've been gathering some narrative around what their thoughts and experiences are. And overwhelmingly, they they want to be supportive and have no idea how and are so afraid of saying and doing the wrong thing that it's more likely than not that they just disengage, not because they don't care or they don't love you, but because they are so afraid of doing it the wrong way that it's easier to just disconnect. So, how do you create those spaces where men feel comfortable to maybe say the wrong thing, but then be able to know how to bring that into a space that feels supportive?
So there are some practices, and I want to credit one of my teachers, Layla Martin, for these practices that I'll share right now. There's one in particular called Desires, Fears, Loves. And in this practice, let me just back up for a moment. One of the things that can be really helpful in these types of conversations is to create a container where one person has an opportunity to speak without being interrupted. And then there's a pause, and then the other person is able to speak. Because there's always a relationship dynamic, or one person can tend to be, take more energetic space in a conversation, or you can end up with a back and forth that gets derailed onto various things. To create a container where, and it's timed, right? So you could use your phone or some kind of timer, where one person just basically has the space to speak and the other person's just listening, is super, super powerful. And also having an agreement around, we're going to try this, and there may be things that come up in what's being said. And if something feels really important that we need to discuss further in detail, we're going to like bookmark that and come back to it later. It's not part of this practice. And that creates a lot of freedom and also capacity for, a much deeper exploration. So the practice that I'm referring to, this desires, fears, loves, is exactly a practice like this, where the couple would face one another and would have 2 minutes. The first person would be like, what is it? One person would ask a question, the other person would answer. And the question would be, what is it that you want? What is it that you desire? And the other person would speak for 2 minutes. 2 minutes is a long time.
Huh.
Uninterrupted, not in conversation, right? So just like the very first question you asked me in this interview, it's like, okay, there's the surface stuff. I want this, this, this. And then it's like, the pause, actually, what is it that I really do want? And then when that 2 minutes is over, the other person says, thank you. And then it switches, right? And then the other person gets to do that. You don't have a discussion about it. You just have the container. Then the next question is, what are you afraid of? So comes back to what you were saying just about a lot of men feeling like they want to be helpful, want to be supportive, but don't know how. So this, perhaps could be an opening. And for men don't talk about what they're afraid of because, they're supposed to be the protectors. They're supposed to be the one who's strong, the rock, who's got it all, figured out. And of course they don't. That's not realistic whatsoever. So this is,
Mhm.
a beautiful question for both. And then the final question, which really creates such a heartfelt connection, is what do you love about me?
Mm.
Yeah. And so the whole exercise, I mean, there's a little break in between, but it's like each person has 2 minutes for each. So the whole thing takes 15 minutes and it creates so much depth and richness. And for couples, who may have been together for decades, they may express things to one another that the other person has never even heard or wasn't even aware of.
Yeah.
And so you could leave it at that, or then it could be something that could be expanded beyond that afterwards, outside of
Yeah.
that ritual container.
Thank you for sharing that practice because I think it absolutely can be really, really helpful for people who are trying to navigate this shift that is happening within and in their relationships. And it is just very approachable, right? When it is something that is 15 minutes, it feels like, okay, this isn't going to be something that's going to take up hours and hours and is going to unleash all of these things, although it might, depending on some of the answers. However, it is feels like it's doable and it's safe, right? Those questions are not intimidating. They're not scary. They just give us the space to, like you said, have conversations that it is entirely possible we have never talked about. And then what are the steps to follow up from that, right? Because I would imagine that if it is a conversation where things come up that we've perhaps never talked about, or when we talk about, what are you afraid of? There could be some really vulnerable bits of information or emotion that come out. So, what is a follow up to that to help support that communication container?
So that's a great question. The first part of my answer will be about where that follow up should happen. So I think a really powerful way to have that type of a conversation is to go on a walk together. So when we are moving our bodies, we decrease cortisol, right? Our bodies are made to move. So particularly if there's a conversation that might have some kind of emotional charge to it, not necessarily something that has a conflict, but maybe it just feels like vulnerable or difficult to express. The act of walking will lower that stress response and, just allow for there to be closeness. You can be holding hands. You're also looking outwards. You tend to be scanning the horizon, which is also another way we regulate the nervous system. So I'm a big, big fan of vulnerable, more difficult conversations on a walk. It's a great, great hack. It's also great to do with your kids, by the way, your teenagers.
Yes.
And so what I would say is, let's say you do that practice, desires, fears, loves, and there's something that comes up. So at the end, you could say, okay, you said this, and I would really like to explore that more. I feel like there's more to be said here. Whatever you want to say. Would you be willing to talk about this later today on a walk or tomorrow? My suggestion is to actually not dive into it right away, to just allow both people to sit with whatever's been said. A lot of it, it's not that it gets worked out in silence, but there's an opportunity, just as you were saying before, of like the body being able to process and alchemize all of these different things. But I would, certainly if there are pieces that come up, I would express them. Like, I'm really curious about your experience around this. Curiosity is such a powerful word. There's leaning into wanting to know more, of wanting to genuinely create more connection. And then, like I said, plan it for another time. And then the big thing is really cultivating our listening skills. People tend to be very good at pretending to listen and really rehearsing what they're going to say next. And so can you just allow yourself to listen not have an answer right away. Maybe you even have an agreement that you're going to take 3 breaths together before the next person responds, and just give yourself space like that. It's a learned skill. And I would say that at least it wasn't for me. Healthy relationships, particularly between couples, was not modeled to me through my family dynamic or even around me. So how would we know how to do these things? We have to kind of be a little bit messy and get in that sandbox and try things. But if we can have some shared agreements around listening, around having space, if something gets charged, can we pause here? Can we regulate? Can we come back to it? All of these things can make, I think that potential for really deep connection and growth. Yeah, just really like it's just can blossom from there when we take the time and have that really, pure intention of wanting to support the other person to really thrive and flourish in the relationship.
Yeah, those are really applicable strategies that couples, families can use right away. So thank you for that. And along with the where things happen, I think you framed context really well also, right? We don't want to engage in these conversations in times when we're already heightened about something. These are conversations that you want to have at a time when if it's a partnership where both people are calm and able to have a conversation, there's not like something that you're actively trying to fix or discuss or untangle, that it's a time where you do come with a regulated nervous system so that you can be with each other and have this conversation at a time where there isn't like there's not a specific end goal in mind, or we're not trying to overcome a conflict. And I think that's really important. And I think the other piece that you framed really, really well is that before the conversation, setting up some norms, right? And that around that, when we are in this conversation, we are just listening. I am not listening to respond. I am not trying to generate my response while you're talking. And we are programmed to do that. Like as a former educator, I think about all the practices in school systems that program children, humans, to be constantly thinking about what your response is going to be. And the faster you have that response, the more successful you're going to be. And so that's the equation we sit in, right? That the faster I can respond to you, the more successful I'm going to be, when really the opposite is true. That when we sit and actually just listen and not center ourselves in how we're going to how we're going to show up, it really changes what it feels like to be in that conversation and changes the dynamic of it significantly.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We have to be really intentional because it isn't our go-to, right? We've been conditioned just exactly as you said to have that response at the ready without actually having considered what the other person just shared.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing so much of this wisdom. This is such a valuable conversation. What resources do you have that you want to share with the audience?
Yes. So I have a guide called the Vibrancy Guide, which is 5 different shifts that women can take to become more connected to their bodies. So pleasure is a really big piece of that. Some pieces around just supporting like optimal metabolic health are also a piece of that, really merging both the kind of sacred and scientific together. So that's a really easy resource to get. Just go to vibrancyguide.com. And you'll find it there. And then also you can explore my website. And I love hearing from people. So if you have questions, I just love having those conversations. And so
Boy, do we ever. Yeah.
we sure do.
So all of those links and all of the ways to connect with Carla will be in the show notes. So make sure you check those out. We'll make it really easy for you to be able to have that exchange of expanding love. So thank you so much for being here today, Carla.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. This was great.
Thank you for hanging out with me on Transforming 45. If you laughed, nodded, or had an oh wow moment, hit follow and share it with your favorite midlife human. Find me on Instagram at @lboat and keep those transformations coming.
Electricast.